James couldn't believe his luck when he first saw the property. 15 acres of pure heaven, complete with a natural lake that sparkled under the afternoon sun. He'd driven past Cedar Ridge Estates dozens of times over the years, always admiring the beautiful homes and well-maintained community. But this property, sitting just beyond the main neighborhood, was something else entirely. The real estate agent had explained that the land was special. It had been there long before the housing development went up around it. When the developers built Cedar Ridge Estates back in the late 90s, this chunk of land with its gorgeous lake wasn't for sale. The previous owner had held on to it for decades. By the time it hit the market, the HOA was already established, and the property had what they called grandfathered status. James would get to enjoy the paved roads and security of living near an organized community, but without most of the restrictive rules that came with it. After 23 years of working as a civil engineer, saving every penny he could, James finally had enough for a down payment. The moment he signed those papers, he felt like he'd won the lottery. His own private lake, no neighbors close enough to complain about noise. Just peace, quiet, and the sound of water lapping against the shore. The first few months were absolute bliss. James would wake up early, make his coffee, and sit on his dock watching the sunrise paint the water in shades of orange and pink. On weekends, he'd spend hours swimming, floating on his back, staring up at the clouds. It was everything he'd dreamed of during those long years of working overtime and living in cramped apartments. His neighbors seemed friendly enough. A few folks waved when they jogged past on the community trail that ran along the edge of his property. One older gentleman even stopped once to tell James how lucky he was to have such a beautiful place. James agreed wholeheartedly. Life was good. Then came that Saturday in July. The temperature had climbed into the mid-90s by noon, the kind of heat that makes the air feel thick and hard to breathe. James had finished mowing his lawn and decided a swim was exactly what he needed. He changed into his swim trunks, grabbed a cold beer from the fridge, and headed down to the lake. The water felt incredible. Cool and refreshing, washing away the sweat and grass clippings from the morning's work. James floated on his back, eyes closed, completely relaxed. This was why he'd bought the place. This exact moment right here. He was probably out there for about 20 minutes when he heard footsteps on his dock. Heavy, purposeful footsteps. James opened his eyes and saw a woman standing there, hands on her hips, staring down at him with an expression that could freeze fire. She was probably in her mid-50s, wearing khaki shorts and a polo shirt with the Cedar Ridge Estates logo embroidered on it. A large badge hung around her neck on a lanyard. Even from the water, James could read it clearly. Board President Patricia Henderson. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice sharp and loud enough to scare away the birds that had been sitting in a nearby tree. "Are you the property owner?" James swam closer to the dock, confused. Yeah. I'm James. Can I help you with something?" The woman didn't smile. Didn't even try to be polite. She pulled out her phone and started taking pictures of him in the water. The clicking sound of the camera app felt weirdly aggressive. "I'm Patricia Henderson, president of the Cedar Ridge Estates HOA," she announced, like she was revealing some impressive title. "I'm here because we've received complaints about unsightly activities on this property." James blinked up at her, water dripping from his hair. "Unsightly activities? I'm swimming in my own lake." "Your swimming is visible from the community trail," Patricia said, gesturing toward the path that ran about 50 feet from the lake's edge. "That falls under our aesthetic standards policy. All recreational activities visible from common areas require prior approval and proper permits." Now James was really confused. He swam to the ladder and climbed out, grabbing his towel from a nearby chair. "Ma'am, I think there's been some kind of mistake. My property isn't part of the HOA. It was grandfathered in before the community was built." Patricia's face started turning an interesting shade of red. "I'm well aware of your property's status," she said, her voice getting tighter. "However, new interpretations of our bylaws give us jurisdiction over any activities that impact the community's visual standards. Your swimming creates an unappealing view for our residents who use the trail." James wrapped the towel around his waist and tried to keep his cool. "Look, I paid good money for this property specifically because it wasn't under HOA rules. I have every right to swim in my own lake." "We'll see about that," Patricia snapped. She took a few more pictures, including some of his property line where it met the trail. You'll be receiving official documentation of this violation within the week. I suggest you review our Community Standards Handbook, which is available on our website. I don't think you have the authority to— I have plenty of authority, Patricia interrupted, her voice rising. I've been board president for 4 years. I know these bylaws inside and out, and I know that this community prides itself on maintaining certain standards. If you want to live like you're at some public beach, maybe you should have bought property somewhere else. James felt his jaw tighten. He'd dealt with difficult people in his career, but this woman was something else. This is my property. Private property. I can swim in my own lake whenever I want. Patricia gave him a cold smile. We'll see what the board has to say about that. Expect to hear from us soon. She turned on her heel and marched back up his driveway toward the main road, her clipboard clutched under one arm like a weapon. James stood there dripping, watching her go, a bad feeling settling in his stomach. He'd been so careful when buying the property. He'd reviewed all the documents, made sure everything was clear about the HOA status. His lawyer had confirmed it. The property deed explicitly stated that he was only responsible for road maintenance fees, nothing else. He wasn't subject to the HOA's architectural review board or their rules about lawn care, paint colors, or apparently swimming in his own lake. But something about the way Patricia had spoken, the confidence in her voice, made him uneasy. She'd said new interpretations of the bylaws. What did that mean? Could they really just reinterpret rules to include property that was specifically excluded? James went inside and pulled up the Cedar Ridge Estates HOA website on his computer. He found the Community Standards Handbook and started reading. Page after page of rules about fence heights, mailbox styles, approved exterior paint colors, and acceptable landscaping plants. There was a whole section on recreational equipment visibility that talked about basketball hoops, trampolines, and above-ground pools, but nothing specifically about swimming in a private lake on grandfathered property. He spent the next hour searching through every document he could find online. The whole time, his relaxing Saturday afternoon felt further and further away. That bad feeling in his stomach just kept growing. By the time the sun started setting, James had made a decision. If Patricia wanted to play this game, he'd be ready. He'd built a career on reading technical documents and understanding regulations. How hard could HOA bylaws be? What he didn't know yet was that this was just the beginning. Patricia Henderson wasn't the type to back down from a fight. And neither was he. The certified letter arrived exactly 2 weeks later on a Wednesday morning. James saw the mail truck pull up and watched the postal worker walk to his mailbox with that distinctive green card. That meant someone had to sign for something. His stomach dropped. He knew what this was. He signed for the envelope and walked back inside, staring at the return address. Cedar Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. Official correspondence. The envelope felt heavier than it should have. James sat down at his kitchen table and opened it carefully. Inside was a 3-page letter printed on fancy letterhead with the HOA logo at the top. The first page was all formal language, the kind that's meant to sound intimidating. Dear property owner, it started, not even using his name. That annoyed him right away. The letter stated that after a thorough review by the Architectural and Standards Committee, it had been determined that his property was in violation of multiple community standards. James felt his blood pressure rising as he read the specific charges. Violation 1. Unauthorized water recreation visible from common areas. Fine. $400. Violation 2. Failure to submit recreational activity permits prior to engaging in water sports. Fine. $300. Violation 3. Creating an environment inconsistent with community aesthetic values. Fine. $300. Total amount due, $1,000. Payment required within 30 days to avoid additional penalties and potential legal action. James read it 3 times, each time getting angrier. Water sports? He'd been floating on his back. And what the hell were community aesthetic values? The whole thing was ridiculous. But the second page was even worse. It outlined the consequences of non-payment. After 30 days, the amount would increase by 50%. After 60 days, they could place a lien on his property. The letter mentioned their extensive legal resources and suggested that fighting the fine would cost him far more than just paying it. The third page was a breakdown of his options. He could pay in full, set up a payment plan with interest, or request a hearing with the board. That last option required a $500 deposit that would be forfeited if the board ruled against him. James grabbed his phone and pulled up Patricia's number. It was listed on the HOA website as the primary contact for compliance issues. He called immediately. She answered on the third ring. Cedar Ridge Estates HOA, Patricia Henderson speaking. It's James Mitchell. I just got your letter. Ah, yes. Her voice had that same cold, satisfied tone from the lake. I trust you understand the seriousness of the situation. This is complete garbage, James said, trying to keep his voice level. My property isn't under your jurisdiction. You can't fine me for swimming in my own lake. The board disagrees, Patricia replied smoothly. We've consulted with our attorney, and he's assured us that the new interpretation of Section 12, Paragraph 4 of our bylaws, gives us clear authority over any activities visible from community property that impact aesthetic values. That's not what my deed says. Your deed is irrelevant to community standards enforcement, Patricia said. You may own the property, but you're still part of this community. The trail that runs past your lake is HOA property. When our residents use that trail, they have the right to an aesthetically pleasing experience. James couldn't believe what he was hearing. So you're saying I can't use my own lake because someone walking by might see me? You can use your lake, Patricia said, her voice taking on a patronizing tone. You simply need to follow the proper procedures. Submit a recreational activity permit, agree to usage hours that don't conflict with peak trail times, and ensure that your activities meet our standards for appropriate outdoor recreation. That's insane. That's community living, Patricia shot back. Perhaps you should have considered that before purchasing property adjacent to an established HOA community. James took a deep breath. Look, I'm willing to bet a real lawyer would disagree with your interpretation. My property was specifically grandfathered in. That means I'm not subject to these kinds of rules. Patricia laughed. Actually laughed. It was a short, dismissive sound that made James grip his phone tighter. By all means, hire a lawyer, she said. The HOA has an annual legal budget of $75,000. We've used the same law firm for 8 years. They know these bylaws better than anyone. How much do you think it'll cost you to fight this? $5,000? $10,000? And that's if you win, which you won't. So this is about money, James said. This is about maintaining standards, Patricia replied. But since you brought up money, let me be very clear. Fighting this will cost you far more than $1,000. The board has already authorized additional monitoring of your property. If we find more violations, and trust me, we will, those fines will add up quickly. Pay the fine, follow the rules, and we can all move forward. And if I don't, there was a pause. When Patricia spoke again, her voice was quieter but somehow more threatening. Then I will personally make sure your life in this community becomes very, very difficult. I've been doing this for 4 years. I know every single rule in our bylaws. I know how to interpret them, and I know how to enforce them. You're not the first person who thought they could ignore HOA authority, and you won't be the last. But they all learn eventually. James felt something shift inside him. That threat was a mistake. A big one. In his years as an engineer, he'd learned that the people who threatened the loudest were usually the ones with the most to hide. And Patricia had just shown her hand. I'll think about it, James said calmly. You have 30 days, Patricia reminded him. The clock is ticking. She hung up without saying goodbye. James sat there for a long moment, staring at the letter on his table. $1,000. For swimming in his own lake. It was extortion, plain and simple. And Patricia's threat about making his life difficult only made it worse. He could pay it. $1,000 would hurt, but it wouldn't break him. Part of him wanted to just make this go away. To avoid the stress and hassle of fighting it. That's probably what most people did. They paid the fines, grumbled about it, and moved on. But James wasn't most people. He'd spent his entire career solving problems, reading complex documents, understanding systems and how they worked. And something about this whole situation felt wrong. Not just wrong because it was unfair, but wrong like there was something else going on. Something Patricia didn't want him to look into. The way she'd mentioned the legal budget, $75,000 a year for a neighborhood HOA, that seemed high. And the way she'd been so confident about her interpretation of the bylaws, but hadn't actually quoted anything specific. Just vague references to Section 12, Paragraph 4. James opened his laptop and pulled up the HOA bylaws again. This time he didn't just skim through them. He started reading every single word, taking notes, cross-referencing sections. If Patricia wanted to play lawyer, he'd show her what real research looked like. Section 12 was about property maintenance standards. Paragraph 4 dealt with visible structures and improvements. James read it 5 times. There was absolutely nothing about recreational activities. Nothing about swimming. Nothing about requiring permits for using your own property. He kept digging. Found the meeting minutes from the last 4 years, all posted online as required by state law. Started reading through them. Most of it was boring stuff. Discussions about landscape contracts, holiday decoration guidelines, pool maintenance schedules for the community pool. But then he found something interesting. 3 months ago, there'd been a vote on expanding interpretive authority for aesthetic standards compliance. It had passed with only Patricia and 2 other board members present. No other homeowners had attended that meeting. The minutes were vague about what exactly the expansion meant. James made a note of it and kept reading. The more he dug, the more questions he had. And questions were good. Questions meant there were answers to find. He spent the rest of that day and most of the evening going through documents. His eyes were tired and his back hurt from sitting so long, but he couldn't stop. There was something here. He could feel it. Around midnight, he finally closed his laptop. He hadn't found the smoking gun yet, but he'd found enough to know he was right. This wasn't just about a swimming violation. Patricia was running some kind of operation, and that $1,000 fine was just the tip of the iceberg. James looked at the letter one more time before putting it in a folder. 30 days. Patricia thought that was a deadline for him to pay. But James saw it differently. 30 days was plenty of time to figure out what was really going on. He'd call his lawyer in the morning, not to fight the fine, but to get advice on how to access more HOA records, financial records, complete bylaw amendment history, everything. If Patricia wanted to make his life difficult, she was about to learn that she'd picked the wrong person to mess with. James's lawyer, Robert Chen, had handled the closing on his property and seemed like the right person to call. When James explained the situation, Robert let out a long whistle over the phone. HOA dispute, Robert said. I'll be honest with you, these can get messy. But the good news is that as a property owner, even a partial member, you have rights to access HOA documents, financial records, meeting minutes, bylaws, all of it. They legally have to provide them. How do I request them? James asked. Send a formal written request to the board. They have to respond within 30 days in most states. If they refuse or drag their feet, that's actually a violation that you can use against them later. James drafted the request that same day. He asked for copies of all financial records for the past 5 years, complete meeting minutes, any bylaw amendments, and records of all fines issued in the past 3 years. He sent it certified mail, just like Patricia had done to him. While he waited for the response, James started doing his own investigation. He created a spreadsheet and began documenting everything he could find online. Meeting minutes, board member names, any public complaints or discussions on neighborhood social media groups. That's when he discovered something interesting. There was a private Facebook group for Cedar Ridge Estates residents. James hadn't joined it before because he hadn't thought he needed to. But now he requested access, and within a few hours he was in. The group had about 200 members, maybe half the households in the community. James scrolled through recent posts. Most of it was typical neighborhood stuff. Someone asking for lawn service recommendations. Another person complaining about a barking dog. Holiday decoration photos, but then he started seeing a pattern. Every few weeks, someone would post a complaint about the HOA, fines that seemed excessive, rules that appeared out of nowhere. And Patricia's name came up again and again. One woman had been fined $300 because her mailbox was the wrong shade of black. Another family got hit with $500 for having their garbage cans visible from the street on a non-collection day, even though they'd been loading their car for a trip. Someone else was fined for having a small decorative garden gnome that supposedly violated the no lawn ornaments rule. The posts were frustrated, but resigned. People would complain, others would commiserate, and then the conversation would die out. No one seemed to be doing anything about it. They'd just pay the fines and move on. James started taking screenshots of everything. Then he did something bold. He made his own post. Hi everyone, I'm James. I own the property with the lake just past the main neighborhood. I recently received a fine from the HOA that I believe is unjustified. I'm curious if others have had similar experiences with fines that seemed excessive or based on unclear rules. If you're comfortable sharing, please comment or send me a private message. I'm looking into this and would appreciate any information. He hit post and waited. Within an hour, his phone started buzzing with notifications. Private messages started flooding in. People who didn't want to comment publicly but had stories to share. The more James read, the angrier he got. One older veteran named Donald had been fined $500 for flying his American flag past sunset. The HOA rule stated that flags needed to be properly illuminated if displayed after dark or taken down. Donald's flag was illuminated, but apparently not bright enough by Patricia's standards. When he'd argued that he'd been flying flags for 40 years and knew the proper protocol, Patricia had added another $200 for insubordination to board authority. A single mother named Lisa had been fined repeatedly for her children's toys being visible in the yard. Even though the bylaws allowed play equipment, Patricia had decided that a small plastic slide was unsightly and didn't meet aesthetic standards. The fines had totaled over $800 before Lisa finally gave the slide away. Stories kept coming. James counted 23 people who reached out to him within the first day. 23 households that had been hit with what seemed like bogus or excessive fines in just the past year. While he was processing all this information, the HOA's response to his document request arrived. It was much faster than the 30-day deadline, which surprised James. But when he opened it, he understood why. The packet was huge. Hundreds of pages. Financial statements, meeting minutes, bylaw amendments, fine records, everything he'd asked for. Patricia had probably thought she'd overwhelm him with paper, make him give up before he found anything useful. She'd miscalculated. James took a week off from work. Told his boss he had some personal business to handle. Then he sat down with all those documents and started reading. He made coffee, cleared his dining room table, and began the deep dive. The financial records were interesting right away. James had worked with budgets and project finances his whole career, so he knew how to read between the lines. The HOA's annual budget was about $300,000. Most of it went to normal stuff. Landscaping contracts, pool maintenance, road repairs, insurance. But there was a line item that caught his eye. Administrative compensation. It had started at $0 5 years ago. Then it appeared 3 years ago at $500 per month. The next year it jumped to $1,000. Then $1,500. The most recent year showed $2,000 per month. $24,000 a year in administrative compensation. Meeting minutes showed that this had been approved as payment for the board president's time and effort. That board president was Patricia. James did the math. Over 3 years, Patricia had paid herself over $50,000 from HOA funds for a volunteer position that was supposed to be unpaid, but it got better, or worse, depending on how you looked at it. James cross-referenced the fine records with the timeline of Patricia's compensation increases. The pattern was clear. As her monthly pay went up, so did the number of fines issued. 3 years ago, the HOA issued about 30 fines total. Last year, they'd issued over 200. The average fine amount had also increased. It used to be around $100 for most violations. Now they were regularly $300 to $500, and the violations themselves had become more subjective. Less your fence is 6 inches too tall and more your landscaping doesn't meet aesthetic standards. James created charts and graphs tracking everything. The evidence was damning. Patricia had essentially turned the HOA into her personal income source by ramping up enforcement and creating vague rules she could interpret however she wanted. But there was more. James noticed that certain addresses never appeared in the fine records. He pulled up the property records and cross-referenced the names. 3 of the properties that had never been fined belonged to the other 2 current board members and Patricia's next-door neighbor. He remembered the meeting minutes where Patricia's compensation was approved. Only 3 people had been present for that vote. Patricia and 2 others. James checked the names. Board members Kevin Walsh and Rita Morrison. The same people whose properties had never received a single fine. James sat back in his chair, staring at his wall of documents and notes. This wasn't just petty tyranny. This was corruption. Patricia had stacked the board with allies, pushed through her own compensation, and then used selective enforcement to generate revenue while protecting her friends. The legal budget she'd mentioned, $75,000, was probably inflated too. James found the actual legal bills in the financial records. Last year, the HOA had paid their lawyer about $12,000. Where was the rest of that money going? He kept digging and found more interesting details. Patricia's own property had multiple violations according to the HOA's own rules. She had a shed in her backyard that was too large and too close to the property line. Her fence exceeded the height limit by at least 6 inches. She'd painted her front door a custom color that wasn't on the approved list. James pulled up Google Street View and confirmed it all. Then he drove by her house himself and took photos. Every violation clearly documented. The hypocrisy was stunning. Patricia was enforcing rules on everyone else while ignoring them herself. And making money doing it. James compiled everything into a detailed report. He organized it chronologically, with clear sections for financial irregularities, selective enforcement, and personal violations. He included charts showing the correlation between fine increases and Patricia's compensation. He attached testimonials from the homeowners who'd contacted him. The document was 42 pages long by the time he finished. It was thorough, well-organized, and damning, but James knew he couldn't just send this to Patricia or the board. They'd bury it. He needed to go directly to the homeowners. He needed to call a special meeting. He pulled up the bylaws again and found the section on special meetings. Any group of homeowners representing at least 15% of the properties could demand a special meeting, and the board was required to schedule it within 30 days. Cedar Ridge Estates had about 150 homes. 15% meant he needed signatures from 23 households. James already had 23 people who'd contacted him about unfair fines. He started reaching out to them, explaining what he'd found and asking if they'd be willing to sign a petition for a special meeting. Every single one of them asked. The community center had never seen a turnout like this. James arrived 30 minutes early and the parking lot was already half full. By the time the meeting was scheduled to start at 7 o'clock, every seat was taken and people were standing along the walls. Someone did a quick count. Over 100 homeowners had shown up. In a community of 150 homes, that was unheard of. James had set up his laptop and projector in advance. He'd prepared a presentation that walked through everything he'd discovered. Charts, graphs, copies of documents, all of it organized to tell a clear story. Patricia sat at the front table with Kevin and Rita, the other 2 board members. She looked nervous but was trying to hide it behind a mask of authority. She kept shuffling papers and whispering to Kevin, who looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. At exactly 7, Patricia called the meeting to order. Her voice was tight and overly formal. "This special meeting has been called by a petition of homeowners," she began. "However, I want to remind everyone that this board has operated with complete transparency and in accordance with all bylaws. Any accusations of impropriety are unfounded and frankly insulting to those of us who volunteer our time for this community." Someone in the back shouted, "Volunteer? You've been paying yourself $2,000 a month." The room erupted. People started talking over each other, voices getting louder. Patricia banged her gavel, trying to restore order. "We will have order," she yelled. "Anyone disrupting this meeting will be asked to leave." "You can't kick out half the neighborhood," someone else called out. James stood up. "Patricia, I requested this meeting. I'd like to present my findings to the community." Patricia's jaw clenched. "Fine, you have 15 minutes. I'll need at least 30. 15, Patricia repeated. "We have other business to conduct." "Actually," James said calmly, "according to Section 19 of the bylaws, the petitioners who call a special meeting set the agenda, and I've allocated 45 minutes for my presentation." He could see Patricia's face turning red even from across the room. She knew he was right. Kevin leaned over and whispered something to her. She nodded stiffly. "Fine, proceed." James turned on the projector. The first slide showed a simple title, "The Truth About Our HOA Finances and Enforcement." He started with the basics. Explained how he'd received a $1,000 fine for swimming in his own lake. Showed copies of the letter. Explained his property's grandfathered status and why the fine was bogus. People were nodding. Several had received similar letters for similar questionable violations. Then James moved to the bigger picture. He put up the financial chart showing Patricia's compensation over 3 years. 3 years ago, the board president position was unpaid, James explained. That's typical for HOA boards. People volunteer because they care about their community. But then, in a meeting attended by only 3 people, a motion was passed to create administrative compensation for the president. That compensation has grown to $2,000 per month, $24,000 per year. The room was silent now. Everyone was staring at the screen. Over 3 years, Patricia Henderson has paid herself over $50,000 from our HOA fees. The silence broke. People started yelling. Patricia tried to interrupt, but James kept talking. But here's where it gets interesting. Look at this next chart. He showed the graph tracking fine frequency and amounts over the same 3-year period. As Patricia's compensation increased, so did the number of fines. We went from 30 fines per year to over 200. The average fine amount tripled, and the violations became more and more subjective. James clicked to the next slide showing examples. Donald's flag violation, Lisa's toy slide violation, others involving mailbox colors and garbage can visibility. These fines generated over $60,000 in revenue last year alone. But that money didn't go to major improvements or necessary repairs. It padded our reserves while Patricia's compensation kept increasing. He could see homeowners getting angrier by the second. People were pulling out their phones, probably calculating how much they'd personally paid in fines. Now, you might think, okay, maybe the fines are excessive, but at least they're being enforced fairly, right? James clicked to the next slide. It showed a map of the neighborhood with properties highlighted in different colors. Red properties are ones that have been fined in the past 3 years. Green properties have never received a single fine. The pattern was obvious. The green properties were clustered together. One was Patricia's house. 2 others belonged to Kevin and Rita. A 4th was Patricia's next-door neighbor. Some people in this community have been fined multiple times for minor issues. Others, including all 3 current board members, have never been fined once. Not even when they have clear violations. James pulled up photos of Patricia's property, her oversized shed, her too-tall fence, her non-approved door color. Patricia Henderson has at least 3 violations according to the HOA's own rules. Rules she wrote and enforces on everyone else. But she's never fined herself. The room erupted again. People were standing, shouting. Patricia was trying to respond, but no one could hear her over the noise. James raised his voice. There's more. Our HOA allegedly has a legal budget of $75,000 per year. But actual legal expenses last year were $12,000. Where's the rest of that money? He showed the financial discrepancies. Line items that didn't add up. Expenses that seemed inflated or vague. I'm not a forensic accountant, but these numbers raise serious questions. Questions that deserve answers. Donald, the veteran who'd been fined for his flag, stood up. I want my money back. That $500 fine was garbage and everyone here knows it. Me too, Lisa called out. $800 for my kid's slide? That's theft. More people started standing, calling out their own experiences. The meeting was becoming chaos, but it was the productive kind of chaos. The kind where people finally had a voice. Patricia tried one more time to take control. This is completely out of order. James Mitchell has presented a biased and misleading interpretation of the numbers don't lie. Someone shouted, let's vote. Another person yelled, vote to remove the board. That got everyone's attention. The room quieted down as people considered it. James had hoped it would come to this, but he hadn't wanted to be the one to suggest it. Better to let the community arrive at the conclusion themselves. Kevin stood up looking miserable. Look, maybe we should table this for now. Let people cool down. We can schedule another meeting. No, James said firmly. We're here now. Everyone's here. Let's address this tonight. He pulled up the bylaws on the screen. According to Section 23, board members can be removed by a majority vote of homeowners present at a meeting where quorum is met. We have over 100 homeowners here tonight. That's well over the 50% quorum requirement. Patricia was gripping the edge of the table now. You can't just remove the entire board. Who would run things? We'll elect a new board. Tonight if necessary, James said. But first let's vote on the current board. Robert Chen, James's lawyer, stood up from where he'd been sitting in the back. I'm here as a legal observer. The bylaws are clear. This vote is legitimate if done properly. James looked around the room. All in favor of removing Patricia Henderson, Kevin Walsh, and Rita Morrison from the HOA board? Please raise your hand. Hands shot up throughout the room. James did a quick count. It wasn't even close. All opposed? 3 hands went up. Patricia, Kevin, and Rita. The motion passes. The current board is removed, effective immediately. Patricia stood up so fast her chair fell over. This is illegal. I'll sue every single person in this room. Sue us with what money? Someone shouted back. You already spent it all paying yourself. Rita was crying. Kevin had his head in his hands. Patricia grabbed her papers and her purse and stormed toward the door. This isn't over, she said as she passed James. You have no idea what you've started. I think I do, James replied calmly. I started holding people accountable. After Patricia left, the room settled down. People were excited, energized. They'd just done something nobody thought was possible. They'd taken their community back. We need a new board, someone said. Who wants to volunteer? Several people raised their hands. Longtime residents who'd been frustrated with Patricia's leadership. Younger homeowners who wanted to get involved. People with financial backgrounds, legal knowledge, management experience. But then Donald stood up again. I think James should be president. He's the one who figured all this out. He did the work. People started clapping. Others voiced their agreement. James tried to wave them off. I'm not even a full HOA member, he said. My property is grandfathered. So what, Lisa said. You care about this community more than Patricia ever did. You proved that tonight. Plus, someone else added, if you're president, you can make sure that bogus fine against you gets thrown out. That got a laugh from the crowd. James sighed. He'd never wanted to be HOA president. The whole point of buying his property was to avoid this kind of responsibility. But looking around the room at all these people who'd been taken advantage of, who'd finally found their voice, he couldn't say no. Okay, James said, but only temporarily, 1 year. We fix the problems, reform the bylaws, get everything running properly, then someone else take. The first official meeting of the new board happened 3 days later. James had never wanted to be in charge of anything related to HOAs, but here he was, sitting at the head of the table in the community center, looking at 4 other board members who were all counting on him to fix this mess. Okay, James said, pulling out his notes. First things first. We need to void the illegitimate fines. I've compiled a list of every questionable fine from the past 3 years based on the records and the homeowner testimonials. That's 42 fines totaling about $37,000. Donald whistled. That's a lot of money to give back. It's money that should never have been taken, Lisa pointed out. These people were scammed. The board voted unanimously to void all 42 fines and issue refunds. James's $1,000 swimming fine was first on the list. He felt a deep satisfaction checking that one off, but then came the harder question. What to do about Patricia? She broke the rules, one board member named Tom said. He was a retired accountant who'd volunteered to review the finances. She paid herself without proper authorization. She enforced rules selectively. She clearly abused her position. The question is whether what she did was illegal or just unethical, James said. That's why we need the professional audit. They'd already hired a forensic accountant. The audit would take a few weeks, but the preliminary findings were damning. Patricia had been creative with the books, but not quite creative enough. While they waited for the full audit, James had another task to handle. Documenting Patricia's property violations. He drove by her house with his phone, taking clear photos. The shed that exceeded size limits. The fence that was 6 inches too tall. The front door painted in an unauthorized color. Then he measured everything, checked it against the HOA rules, and documented it all in a formal violation report. The new board reviewed the violations at their next meeting. They were clear, undeniable. Patricia had broken the same rules she'd zealously enforced on everyone else. So what do we fine her? Lisa asked. James pulled up the fine schedule that Patricia herself had created. According to the rules, she wrote, oversized structure is $300. Fence violation is $500. Unauthorized exterior paint is $200. That's $1,000. Seems low, Tom said, given what she did to everyone else. It gets better, James said. There's also something in the bylaws about accountability for board members who abuse their position. Section 47. I didn't know it existed until I really dug deep. Patricia probably forgot about it or figured no one would ever use it against her. He read from his laptop. Any board member found to have willfully abused their authority or acted against the community's best interests may be subject to corrective assessments, as determined by a vote of the full board and ratified by homeowners. So we can fine her for being corrupt? Donald asked. Essentially, yes. It's meant to hold board members accountable. We'd have to justify it, document it, and put it to a vote. But yes. The board spent the next hour discussing what constituted appropriate corrective assessment. They documented every instance of selective enforcement. Every case where Patricia had fined someone for something, while ignoring the same violation on properties belonging to her friends. The favoritism shown to Kevin and Rita. They calculated the total cost to homeowners from Patricia's actions. The excessive fines. The inflated compensation she'd paid herself. The damage to community trust. Tom suggested $2,000. Lisa argued for $5,000. Donald thought they should go even higher. James proposed a compromise. $3,000 for the property violations using her own fine schedule. $2,000 for abuse of authority and selective enforcement. That's $5,000 total. It's significant but defensible. The board agreed. They drafted the formal notice documenting everything with photos, records, and testimonials. James made sure every word was accurate and supported by evidence. Patricia might threaten to sue, but she'd lose if she tried. They sent the notice certified mail, same as she'd done to so many others. Patricia's response came within 2 days. Her lawyer sent a letter calling the fines retaliatory and without merit, and threatening legal action if they weren't withdrawn immediately. James had expected this. He'd already prepared a response with Robert Chen's help. The reply was calm, professional, and devastating. It outlined every violation with photos and measurements, referenced the exact bylaw sections Patricia had violated, included copies of fines she'd issued to other homeowners for identical violations, proving that the standard being applied to her was the same one she'd created and enforced on others. The corrective assessment was backed up with a detailed report showing the pattern of abuse, selective enforcement, and financial impropriety. James included testimonials from 42 homeowners. He cited Section 47 of the bylaws that explicitly allowed for such assessments. The letter ended with a simple statement. These fines are legitimate under the rules Ms. Henderson herself wrote and enforced. Payment is due within 30 days. Failure to pay will result in the same enforcement actions Ms. Henderson applied to other homeowners during her tenure as board president. Patricia's lawyer never responded. 2 weeks later, the forensic audit came back. It was even worse than James had suspected. Patricia hadn't just been paying herself unauthorized compensation. She'd been inflating other expenses, too. The legal budget she'd mentioned? Most of that money had been redirected to her administrative compensation through creative accounting. Over 3 years, she'd taken over $70,000 that should have gone to community improvements and maintenance. The auditor's report used words like misappropriation and breach of fiduciary duty. They recommended reporting the findings to state authorities for potential criminal investigation. The board met to discuss their options. This had gone beyond petty HOA politics. Patricia might have actually committed fraud. We have to report it, Tom said. This is criminal, James agreed, but he wanted to give Patricia one chance. Let's send her the audit findings. Give her 30 days to make full restitution. If she pays back what she took, we won't pursue criminal charges. That's too generous, Lisa argued. Maybe, James said, but think about it practically. A criminal investigation takes forever. It's expensive. It keeps this mess alive for years. If she pays it back, we get our money, she faces consequences, and we can move on. After some debate, the board agreed. They sent Patricia a formal demand letter. $70,000 for the misappropriated funds, $5,000 for the property violations and corrective assessment, $75,000 total, due in 30 days or they'd file a criminal complaint with the district attorney's office. James didn't expect her to pay. He figured she'd fight it, drag it out, maybe actually end up facing charges. But 3 weeks later, a cashier's check arrived. $75,000. No note, no explanation, just the payment. Patricia's house went up for sale the next week. The board deposited the money and immediately allocated it to the projects Patricia had been neglecting. New playground equipment, repairs to the community pool, resurfacing some of the roads. The stuff that actually mattered to residents. They also reformed the bylaws, eliminated the subjective aesthetic standards language that Patricia had abused, put clear limits on fines, required full board approval for any board member compensation, made the enforcement process transparent with mandatory documentation and appeal rights. James created a new position, community ombudsman. Someone homeowners could go to if they felt a fine was unfair, an independent check on board power. The reforms passed with overwhelming homeowner support. 6 months into James's term as president, Cedar Ridge Estates was a different place. People actually showed up to board meetings. Homeowners felt like they had a voice. The Facebook group that had been full of complaints was now full of constructive suggestions and community event planning. Donald organized a Veterans Appreciation Day. Lisa started a community garden. New committees formed for social events, neighborhood watch, and maintenance oversight. People were engaged in a way they never had been under Patricia. James still found it ironic sometimes. He'd bought his property specifically to avoid HOA drama, and now he was running one. But he'd also learned something important. HOAs weren't inherently bad. They were tools. And like any tool, they could be used to build something good or to tear things down. Patricia had used the HOA as a weapon and a personal ATM. James and the new board were trying to use it as what it was supposed to be, a way for neighbors to work together to maintain and improve their community. The 1-year mark of James's term approached. He'd promised it would be temporary, and he meant it. At the annual meeting, he announced he wouldn't be running for re-election. The community tried to convince him to stay. They'd gotten used to his steady leadership and thorough approach to problems. But James held firm. This year was about fixing what was broken, he told the assembled homeowners. That work is done. Now you need someone who actually wants to be involved in community leadership, someone who'll bring fresh energy and new ideas. They elected Tom as the new president. He'd been passionate about financial oversight and transparency. James stayed on as an advisor for the transition, but he was ready to step back. On a warm,